everybody, and welcome to today's program. My name is John Napoli, and I'm the co-managing partner at Seyfarth's New York office, co-chair of the firm's national tax practice, and a member of the firm's executive committee. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in today. Seyfarth is delighted to host this esteemed panel of cyber security experts who will discuss the most pressing security issues that all companies face today. If recent events have taught us anything, it's that no business, industry, or organization is immune to cyber attacks, and that cyber attacks are on the increase. This timely program was spearheaded by the newest member of this firm's cybersecurity team, Paul Ferrillo. We're delighted to welcome Paul to the firm and to the New York office. He joins our team with a multi-dimensional litigation practice and solidifies an important New York presence in our global privacy and cybersecurity team. Paul is best-in-class cybersecurity first responder and someone you want on your team if you get attacked. He has extensive experience in a wide range of industries, including retail, aerospace, financial services, investment banking, private equity, and energy, just to name a few. Many of you on this call know Paul, and he really doesn't need much more introduction. He's also a terrific guy. At this time, without much talking, I'd like any more talking on my part, I'd like to turn it over to Paul to introduce the rest of the panel. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate the nice, warm introduction. Pleasure, to be with everybody, and great to be at Seyfarth. Such an impressive law firm. Talk about impressive. Somebody said to me the other day, boy, it seems like cybersecurity is in the news every day. I said, yeah, seems so. I think the other thing that I said to Kate Fazzini before we started is, as I'm preparing for the webinar, this has been one of the most hardest webinars I've ever had to prepare for, because every morning I go on, there's 6, 10, 12 articles, and Chris Comiskey has spoken to another set of reporters, as well too. So it's hard to stay up with Chris. So just two housekeeping matters. We have a lot of content, and we have a lot of important stuff to discuss. I'm going to be your moderator. If you have questions, we'll take questions during the presentation. Just go to the Q&A box, ask your questions. If there's a time to ask the question, I certainly will. We want to make this a collaborative, my mother would have said, a chatty sort of experience where we're chatting back and forth, and we're exchanging thoughts and ideas. I think it's important. I think President Biden called it in his executive order, information sharing. So I think, if we can help start a trend, that would be great. Ask your questions, we'll take them during the presentation. If we're going late, we'll take them after the presentation. There's going to be continuing legal education, for this seminar. At the end of the day, I'll read a code. I won't read it now because you might hang up on me, but I'll read a code at the end of the day. So I want to introduce our panelists. I'm going to go left to right on my screen. I'm going to go left to right. Jerry, why don't you talk about Sony and give a few words about your practice?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Pleasure to be here with such a great panel of esteemed individuals and speaking to everyone today. I'm Jerry Bessette, Booz Allen Hamilton's Senior Vice President for Incident Response. We've got a great team at Booz Allen Hamilton. We work well over 100 matters a year, enterprise-level breaches. We are also the largest provider of cybersecurity to the U.S. government, so definite experience with the APT threat. I've been with the firm for several years. I've also acted as an outsourced CISO for several corporations and worked a large number of incident response matters, managed them, large ransomware matters, as well as done proactive compliance assessments. And then prior to coming to the private sector 5 years ago, I served 24 years with the FBI as a special agent, retired as a senior executive in the FBI Cyber Division, where I was Chief of Technical Operations and managed the National FBI Cyber Incident Response Program, the National Cyber Action Team, as well as had oversight for the 56 cyber task forces around the country, and was the individual executive responsible for the investigation into the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures, as well as the data breach of the U.S. Post Office. So unfortunately, I've seen the worst that can happen to both a private corporation and a government agency, and I hope now that working with law firms like yours, Paul, and other organizations, we can enable clients to mitigate this risk. Thanks.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Jerry. And it's great to work with you. You've got a fantastic team, and you're my first phone call. Chris Kaminsky, please tell us a little bit about yourself. You have a pretty storied background as well, too. Chris, you're on mute.
Yeah, there we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Well, thank you, John and Paul and the firm for putting this together. I feel like the slacker of the bunch when I look at this lineup of talented cyber individuals, so I'm very appreciative to be included. Over the last 7 years, I've been advising private companies, largely the federal practices here in DC, federal agencies, state governments and boards of directors on cybersecurity and homeland security related issues, and some management consulting as well. I spent 6 years in senior leadership at DHS. My last job was as the Undersecretary for Management, which is the #3 job over there at the department. Also has Chief Acquisition Officer responsibilities. So you get to oversee all the $19 billion worth of spend that they do annually. Before that, I was in state government for 18 years, 6 as a state CIO, and then before that, 12 years as a state House member and a state senator before coming to Washington as part of the Obama administration. And as Paul, you indicated, this is in the news every day, and I think it's really broken through with SolarWinds and Colonial to show folks the day-to-day impacts that are really coming to fruition as a result of a lot of these attacks. And so I'm just pleased to be in this arena and being able to share a few thoughts today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Really great of you to take time out of your schedule. Kate Fazzini and I met probably 5 years ago. I remember the function because Chris Roberts, one of the most notorious, infamous white hat hackers, had a kilt on that day, and I was forever taken by the fact that he must be really confident in his cyber skills, Kate, because he was wearing a kilt, you know, in the same room as all of these officials. So, Kate, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thank you, Paul, and I'll echo what Mr. Napoli said, that Paul Farrell is a great guy. I really appreciate him taking me on this amazing panel today, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. My name is Kate Fazzini. I own a cybersecurity consulting firm called Floor Alba. We are an affiliate of Pinkerton's. And also, I spent the last several years in journalism, so people know me. Cybersecurity for the Wall Street Journal, and then for CNBC, including on air and on digital. Before that, I worked in cybersecurity for about 15 years. I was a vice president in cybersecurity operations at JP Morgan Chase. After that, I worked for a firm called Promontory Financial Group, which is now a part of IBM, a big Washington firm that is. And I've never worked for the government, so I don't know how that puts me with everybody else here, but I take a little bit of pride in that sometimes. So that's my story. And I also teach cybersecurity at Georgetown University, and I'm starting a new cyber warfare lecture at Yeshiva University in Manhattan in the fall. Looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Very impressive, background. Great reporter, great writer, great speaker. Last is a guy who I know very well, Bob Zukas. Bob is CEO of the Digital Directors Network. I teach classes with Bob. Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about DDN?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and great to be here. I appreciate you having me. So I'm the founder and CEO of a group called Digital Directors Network. All we do is help corporate boards understand digital and cybersecurity risk oversight and get better at governing these issues. Our claim to fame is we were one of the first voices talking about systemic risk 4 years ago, and now this is exploding right before our very eyes. My background, I was a PwC management consulting partner for 30 years, lived and worked all over the world, ran our IT strategy and ops business and our West Coast cyber practice. And I'm now an adjunct professor at the USC Marshall School of Business as well. Happy to be here.
Let's get into it right away. Kate, I'm going to ask you to open up the question. For those that, perhaps were living under a stone the last 6 months, what happened with the SolarWinds attack? What do we know? What can you tell us about what happened?
Well, I've done several briefings on this since then, and one thing I've learned is that it helps to take people back and explain to them what SolarWinds is first, so that they can understand why this happened. So SolarWinds, for those on this call who might not be in the weeds like we are with this stuff, it's a network management software that is pretty much ubiquitous in the Fortune 500. What's network management software? So it does all kinds of tasks for corporations, bandwidth, performance monitoring, other tools like that. So a lot of reach, a lot of scope, and they're constantly getting updates to all of these different types of programs that they have. So, well, I can't talk. I'm sorry. This investigation is still going to be ongoing for a really long time. We know that because we've seen what's happened with other government agencies that have had attacks of similar scope. But what we know so far is that it's most likely, there's numerous possibilities, but most likely SolarWinds was targeted it just simply through an Office 365 vector, a spear phishing attack against somebody who the attackers who the US government has identified as being Russian based, I believe. The attackers were able to access through there. From there, they were able to infiltrate the company's system that updates their software, and those updates that get pushed to other corporations. So, there's an enormous spread. SolarWinds has about 300,000 customers. Again, numerous Fortune 500 companies, numerous companies or numerous agencies within the federal government, and that faulty update was pushed to those. About 18,000 so far have been identified as being actually hacked as a result of this and potentially at risk for losing data. Many of those are really critical government agencies. So this is just a perfect example of kind of third-party oversight, why it's so important, why it's so difficult, because there are so many software companies like this. They're spread so far, and we don't really know, who is managing their security, and nor do we know how the companies are interacting with them in terms of, rating them and figuring out if they have vulnerabilities. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And you raised a bunch of issues that we're gonna hit on, obviously. Chris, up to you. How did the government react? Did they react, aggressively to this? What about DHS, CISA, and the NSA?
So it's been an interesting arc over, it's really been a 10-year discussion in the federal government that I think just a little bit of a capsule on that would help. It goes back to about 2011, 2012, when there was a lot of ambiguity as to who was responsible for what in the federal government around cyber. You had three main players. The National Security Agency has a lot of cyber capability in its cryptology background. The FBI, certainly on cyber investigations, was becoming more prominent. And then you had this nascent effort over at the Department of Homeland Security, which at that point was a headquarters directorate operation with two programs of record that were coming online. One was Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, which was a program that John Seyfarth had brought over from the State Department to basically know what's on your network, know who's on your network, and be able to build a sensor system so that you could have dashboarding and know what's on federal agency networks. In addition to that, you also had what's commonly referred to as Einstein, which was about 10 years old at that point. And Einstein is basically an information sharing platform. But as NSA moved out of that space and said to DHS, you take this over, DHS came up with this thing called Einstein 3 Accelerated, which was really an effort to look at specific signature-based activity, both classified and unclassified, and apply that to network traffic through this nesting or the ISPs, aggregating all of the 2 million seats in the federal government and flowing all your traffic through that and looking for certain malicious activity. And so Congress basically made a decision around 2015 that DHS was going to be responsible for federal civilian or the .gov domain. And so you had this crystallization of additional authorities and authorization coming to DHS in that space and additional monies around 2015-16. So you had the OPM hack that took place. People were starting to understand that you needed to centralize this. And so with the Trump administration coming in, there was really a pivot away from a centralized approach of having a cyber coordinator at the White House and really more of a agency by agency approach to things. And so as we've seen this come to fruition today with what we're seeing with SolarWinds, you really have a proliferation of players now in the new administration. DHS is more mature, has more authorities and money. The White House has added a deputy director at the National Security Council. There is now, by congressional mandate, a cyber coordinator role that requires Senate confirmation. The NSA, which Rob Joyce has reasserted itself into the space. And so I think that one of the things you're going to have to see with both SolarWinds and Colonial and any other activity that takes place in cyber is really an understanding of roles and responsibilities across the federal space. And then what this EO that the president has just issued is going to actually mandate agencies to do in the execution of that. So a long way of saying there's a lot of movement in the space that's going to have to be deconflicted and synthesized.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to come back to you because one of the pieces that President Biden put in place was the executive order, and I want to talk a lot about that. But let me ask a different question. Bob, you study boards of directors, you study board committees. What can you tell from what you read, in disclosures or else, was a company so critical to industry, so critical to the United States? Did they recognize the cyber risk here? Did they recognize the systemic risk implications of their business, or were they just happy as a lark and just went on their merry way? What can you tell, Bob?
Yeah, Paul, it's whenever there's a big breach like this, the first thing we do is we go to the boardroom and how was the board approaching these issues. We do that for a reason, because the board's a critical control in the whole cybersecurity system and the whole cybersecurity process, but most companies don't view it as really a control point. And SolarWinds was fascinating. So it's largely owned by two private equity firms. And if you look at where accountability was within the boardroom for cybersecurity risk oversight, very, very atypical. They had tasked their Nom and Gov committee, the Nominating and Governance Committee, to oversee cybersecurity risk. Now, we gleaned all this from public disclosure information. And as you dig into that, you start to see some interesting, I think, anomalies, disparities in how they were approaching this issue. For one, that's not a stated responsibility within the charter. We actually only were able to figure that out by diving into the proxy statement, where they fortunately disclosed it. Very, very atypical. Most companies throw cybersecurity risk oversight into the audit committee as an oversight, something that we think is a very poor practice for multiple reasons. Then as we started to look at the skills and capabilities of the board for SolarWinds, again, beneficially owned 84% by these two private equity firms, there were three committee members, one of which, I think CIO of JetBlue, one of which who has pretty extensive digital and cybersecurity skills and capabilities. The other two, one sits on a lot of boards of cyber firms as an executive, as a PE executive, and then the other executive was the chief executive for one of the funds. So fairly shallow in terms of skills and capabilities in the boardroom. And another warning sign that we saw was, of the 3 members, 2 of them had full-time jobs, and amongst those 3, they had 10 board seats amongst themselves. So how much time are they truly spending on the responsibility of oversight that this strange nom and gov committee is kind of tasked with in the proxy statement, but not as a formal part of the charter? But if you look at their risk factor disclosures, how they're understanding risk, they weren't bad, actually. They weren't bad. They talked about nation state issues. They talk about third parties. They were fairly comprehensive in terms of how we assess these against our framework. But you have to question whether they were, frankly, dialing it in around these issues. And we've seen from the courts recently, the words used, the trappings of risk oversight. So are the trappings there, but is the work not getting done? And I think if you look at what they've done post-breach, one of the first things they do is they now have a tech and cybersecurity committee. They set up a standalone committee, and they've since added additional directors, and certainly the new CEO who has deep cybersecurity experience to this new committee. So I think it's an admission on their part that maybe they weren't doing enough at the governance level to truly do the work of oversight. And again, this is a critical control point, and you need people in the boardroom that understand these issues. The board has to be organized effectively, and you have to understand risk in the right way. They didn't use the words systemic risk, and they didn't really describe risk as a systemic thinker would. They had kind of some of the parts described, but they weren't really viewing risk management as a system that they were responsible for, and as a system where their tools and their technologies introduced risk to a much broader ecosystem. And I think that's going to be interesting to watch, because I think regulators may start to hold the tech industry to a higher standard if you're introducing risk to broader ecosystems and to other companies. You'll be held to a higher standard to understand, disclose, and mitigate systemic risk.
Thanks, Bob. We'll come back to you a little bit about what boards can be doing to prepare for the next big attack. But Jerry, I have a question for you. People think sometimes that if there's a hack, you find out about it immediately. Like you'll see something, like ransomware, all of a sudden you'll get the black screen of death. There's been some reports about SolarWinds that the attackers, I'll say, Kate, the Russian SVR might have been on the network for upwards of 9 months before unleashing these attacks and unleashing the malware that allowed people to spy on the networks. Jerry, is it possible for an attacker to be on your network for 9 months and not know he was there?
Yeah, Paul, absolutely. These sophisticated attackers do what we call, they move low and slow. And so in this case, with such a sophisticated attack, they believe it may have dated back as far back as January of 2019. And as you know, the Trojan, the malware, basically the backdoor was embedded into the code of the update that clients went to download. And then once that update was downloaded, the malware was designed to just sit quiet for 2 weeks. And then after 2 weeks, it would call home. And then once it would call home, they would download additional access, additional malware that was designed to embed itself into the memory and not leave tracks on the network. So very hard to detect. And then once they would get on the network, they would compromise someone's credentials. So it was just very, very, very hard. And this is a system, the Orion, software is designed to monitor network traffic. So the malware would disguise itself as normal network traffic and constantly be moving back and forth. And then once on the network, they would harvest credentials and try to act like someone within that individual organization as they moved around. So very, very sophisticated adversary. They took their time, they didn't rush, they waited, and they used very sophisticated tools that were designed to circumvent and look for standard security procedures. So unless someone was really employing, a multifaceted defense in depth approach where not only were they using, security apparatuses, but also hunting and looking for those out of the ordinary things. What connections should not be made at certain times? What systems should not be talking to other systems? You know, they really would not have uncovered this. So not everybody is capable of this type of attack, but most certainly the Russians are.
Thanks, Jerry. We'll talk a little bit about the multifaceted, approach here at the end of the day. Gang, as you know, I don't only respond to breaches, but I litigate cases as well too. And very often it's important to understand the character and the type of witnesses that you're dealing with, whether it's in the C-suite, whether it's in the boardroom, whether it's in the IT department as well too. We usually interview people and really understand not only what happened, but what happens if they get called into a state attorney general investigation or an SEC investigation. I always try to watch this because more and more cybersecurity breaches are ending up in the newspaper. They're ending up in litigation. Kate, you've seen a bunch of CEOs and you've seen a bunch of people testify in your career. How did SolarWinds do in Congress? How did they do in media? Did they handle this situation better than most, worse than most, or about right in the middle?
This is a great question because as part of one of the courses I built at Georgetown, one of the final projects is that my students have to get in a group and they have to do congressional testimony as if they've been a company that's been breached, and they have all of their, this is all the stuff that happened, and they get some pretty, building in some harsher questions for them to have to answer in front of Congress. So it's something I'm used to grading, and I gave SolarWinds a gentleman's C here. I hope that it's a little middle of the road for some people, but one of the reasons I think a lot of people remember when this first came out, there was the issue of the now former CEO who blamed an intern. And of course, those of us in this industry know that that sort of thing does not fly. It doesn't fly with the press. It doesn't fly with the board. It doesn't fly with shareholders or citizens in general. So that was a really low point, I think. But the congressional testimony, the hearing was fine. It sort of came out with these recommendations that these hearings always come out with, which are, we need better cyber hygiene, more public-private partnerships, and more information sharing. But I think there's still not a lot of recommendation from Congress that is concrete on how to do that. I think what was actually more interesting for me was the testimony that was not given, and that was from Amazon. Amazon was called in to testify, as a lot of this activity happened on AWS platforms. And this is not the first time that Congress has shown some interest in Amazon for this reason. And to Bob's point, we have 8 organizations in this country that are designated as SIFMUs, or systemically important financial market utilities. Regulators are really looking at whether something like a cloud platform represents also one of these systemically important utilities and should be regulated as such, regulated like the DTCC or similarly. So I think that out of this, AWS is definitely going to have a target on its back because they're the biggest, but really so many players in the technology space should be aware that this is the way regulators are thinking. They know that all of these companies are using, whether it's SolarWinds software or the Azure cloud platform, that everybody is using these same tools. Does that mean that those tools need to have more oversight because they could present a systemic risk if the NYSE was shut down, or there was a major run on banks or something of that nature? I think that we'll see global regulators looking at it that way. Sorry to go off a little bit the topic.
No. That's Quite all right. I think it's important to look at the ecosystem and look at the environment. And let's talk a little bit about the regulators. But first, Chris, let's talk a little bit about the Biden administration. They came in, and did some great things and put some great people in office, like Rob, and like Ann Neuberger as well too. But most recently, last week, they came out with an executive 34-page executive order on cybersecurity. And I'm going to ask a bunch of questions on this, but to the extent you can, Chris, can you walk us through the most critical pieces of the executive order? What did it say? When is it going to apply? Who does the executive order apply to? Chris, you're on mute.
Yeah, so there's a lot of moving parts to this, as you would expect. One of the things I was pleasantly surprised about with this particular executive order is that it really did try to build on kind of an apolitical framework of taking the best practices out there, things that we can all agree on need to occur, and put them in one document to create a framework for at least a discussion around some of the major aspects of what needs to occur. So, some would say it's too broad or it doesn't specify enough. It's kind of the nature of executive orders. When you have these put out there, there are a series of milestones and tumblers in the document itself that task, primarily Justice Department, NSA, Cyber Command, DHS, Energy, other major agencies that have a major impact on the cyber dimensions to have specific things occur. Specifically, it's one of the things they're talking about is changing the contracting structure at the federal government. Oftentimes what you'll find, we certainly found at DHS, is that when something like a supply chain attack happens like this, oftentimes the language in there for either reporting requirements or specific things that you want your vendors to do is not written into the contract. And so as a result, companies are like, well, it's not in there, so I'm not doing it. We found that to be the case, certainly with the OPM breach. And there have been improvements since then, but there's a lot of work to do as to the rolling nature of contracting in the federal government and how that relates to the FAR. Also, as you would expect, there's a lot of legacy systems running around, particularly the larger federal agencies, and the inability to run zero trust architecture or advanced vulnerability management detection systems is fairly prolific across the federal space. And so updating federal systems has been a push in the EO and in the American Rescue Plan, where they were able to allocate $1 billion to the Technology Modernization Fund to start to seed some of this modernization work in the agencies, eliminate the match requirement, make it a little more accelerated and agile in the process. Also, they're looking at enhanced supply chain security, the risk management things that you referenced at the top, creation of a NTSB-like incident board that would look at the fallout from specific large incidents, and improving the overall investigative and information sharing environment that Kate talked about, that I think most people agree needs to happen, but it's easy to say, and then companies like SolarWinds or Colonial are then hesitant to actually share the information. They may call the FBI, but it doesn't make it to CISA at DHS until several days later. And so having a structure in place that allows for that to be more methodical, so that we don't act like every incident is the first incident in the federal government, I think is a step forward.
Thanks, Chris. One of the things I noticed about the executive order is it started out with, we're all in this together. This was not just the government, this was not just the private sector, but it was, we're in this together. And then right after that, they get into information sharing as well too. Now, Jerry, as a former, assistant director, in the cyber division and home office, you've certainly had experience with information sharing, and certainly now in the private sector investigating and remediating, dealing with breaches. How important is the executive's order? I would say reinitiation, re-emphasis on information sharing between the public and the private sector.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, information sharing is extremely important for a number of reasons. Number one, first and foremost, as a former FBI investigator, information sharing is important because typically from one attack, we don't get enough of the breadcrumbs to put the pieces together to identify the individuals. This year, really since the beginning of the year, there's been several major takedowns of groups, the Egregor group, which is a ransomware group, as well as the Networker group. And then, there's been significant indictments of APT groups over the course of the past several years. And that comes from piecing together the pieces from usually multiple hacks. You've got to find some of the information from one organization, more pieces of the information over here, maybe something from, a Bitcoin wallet. So number one, information sharing is extremely important, to impose a cost upon the adversary and to get attribution so the government can then decide the appropriate course of action if it's not going to be indictment and arrest. And sometimes we are able to put, indict these individuals and years later actually arrest them and extradite them home to the United States, stand trial in a U.S. courtroom, and ideally go to a U.S. prison. Secondarily, information sharing is extremely important during a breach because the FBI, in concert with our partners at DHS, we want to get that information out to like businesses, like individuals in that industry, so they can protect themselves quickly. If they have not already been compromised, we want to get those indicators of compromise and the TTPs out to those organizations so they can protect themselves. And so, extremely important. Obviously, due to the legal risk, the reputational risk, companies are often very hesitant to share information. And so the more it can be, either mandated or encouraged without repercussion, the better all of us will be, and I think the more secure.
Well, Jerry, what a lot of people don't understand is, I found it on the F-35 fighter jet program. When you share information with the government, they share information back with you as well too. And the FBI office that was in charge of the investigation shared TTPs with us, shared IP addresses, and shared a lot of good information that allowed us to ultimately find out, within some degree of certainty, who caused the attack. So I think information sharing is a critical component of the executive order. Let's break for a second and get back to risk and cyber risk, because it's something that you, as much as you talk to boards of directors about it, they don't understand it, or it isn't explained to them in a way where board of directors can understand it. And, I usually, Kate and Bob, I usually talk about, risk, in a cumulative sense, that it's going to cost, $8 million to clean up the investigation, and there's a market capitalization loss that you probably are going to suffer, and that could be severe. Kate and Bob, have you guys done any research yet? We'll start with Kate. Was there a market cap loss here with SolarWinds?
So I can start off a little bit. We did see the SolarWinds stock drop to a 52-week low right after this came out. It's actually been unusual. In my past roles in journalism and in consulting, I've done a lot of research into how much of an effect these attacks have on a company's stock price and its valuation. And the truth is that it typically does not have much of an effect. Equifax, which has so many shareholder lawsuits and that you guys are all aware of, really has recovered from what happened, and they actually recovered fairly quickly in terms of their stock price. But SolarWinds has kind of stayed at a 20 to 30% below where they were in December 2020 before this was disclosed. And what goes along with that, certainly they're going to see shareholder lawsuits. I think they're almost never that interesting in the sense that whenever there's a big stock drop because of something that happened, there are always these lawsuits that come in. So, you know, it's just an obvious thing that's going to happen. I think that this one actually might have a little bit more legs because it's different in the sense that the hack itself was done against something that the company considered its most valuable asset. And obviously the market is recognizing that. This is their software. This has infected their software update. It is right there within the, you know, their value proposition. And that's why I believe the stock has hovered at a lower price. It goes to prove that boards and companies need to really risk rank their assets so that when they are making cybersecurity decisions, that they are putting the most protection behind the thing that represents their company. If it's in Equifax's case, it was very close to that as well, because of course they are a keeper of social security numbers and they lost social security numbers. In this case, it was the software itself has been hijacked and the software is what they sell. So being able to put those numbers behind it is something important for corporations. I'm sorry, I took up, I think Bob was the one who was joining me on that.
No, Bob, I was going to follow up on Kate's great answer there. Bob, are boards considering reputation risk when they look at the whole cyber risk, systemic risk equation?
Yeah, but it's really moving to the financial risk. Something Kate said, you know, the view, you know, protecting your asset. Hackers have figured out that your asset is the business, and the most valuable asset you have as a business is your ability to function. So your ability to transact. So ransomware shuts down the business. So it's not looking at the individual asset, it's looking at the system that hackers are exploiting. And if you look at the largest data losses over the last 5 years, 14% of them, the total cost, the hard costs of whatever fines, penalties, remediation, whatever business continuity loss, what other hard losses there were, 14% of them have exceeded annual revenues for the top 100 companies. Now, some of those companies are smaller in size, but we're starting to see this catastrophic issue of business continuity being the real risk. It's not the market share loss. It's not the reputational loss. It's your ability to function as an organization. And, you know, when you have CNA Insurance, you know, suffer a ransomware attack, one of the largest insurers, cyber insurers in the country, and they pay $40 million to come back online. You know, and they're not doing what they need to do to prevent these type of catastrophic impacts from happening. We have a real business continuity problem with these issues, and hackers frankly have figured out that the system itself is the weak point, and let's have the system do the damage for us. And that's what they're exploiting right now. There is a systemic approach to attack the systemic weaknesses and frailties in the complex systems that we've built. So these latest hacks that we've seen are specifically targeted towards systemic weakness, and they're going to continue.
Hey, Chris, back to you on the Biden executive order. You've been in government for a while. You were in DHS at a very critical time period. Question for you, question for Jerry, really question for everybody. Tell us a little bit about the vendor risk management aspects of the executive order. Chris, what are companies that deal with the government supposed to be doing? You know, is there any more guidance for, you know, for companies that you can give us?
Sure. So they're really looking at it through a couple of lenses here. One is the regulatory lens that other panelists were talking about, which is what we're seeing with the response to Colonial Pipeline yesterday, where DHS says we're going to mandate information sharing from pipeline providers and across that critical infrastructure sector out of TSA, which you wouldn't inherently think TSA has that responsibility, but they do. And then beyond that, they're also looking at you know, a scoring system or a certification process that software vendors to the federal government would have to go through to make it clear that they have met the threshold of a certain standard for compliance on cyber standards, and then that would be certified and then provided as an option available to federal agencies to procure. So they're looking at it through a couple of different lenses, but I think that what they're trying to do is raise the game for software capabilities in the federal government so that there's less attack space and there's more visibility into the products so that agencies will have a better sense of whether or not they're getting the kind of protections that they're looking for.
Hey, so Jerry, I have a question for you now, following up on what Chris just said. How difficult, how easy it is, is it possible to put together, a vendor risk management, supply chain risk management program? Is this something that's easy to do, hard to do, or it really depends how big the company is and how many vendors they have?
Yeah, obviously it depends on the size of the enterprise and the number of vendors, but really, as I mentioned before, supply chain attacks are extremely difficult to detect. So most certainly all organizations should have a third-party, vendor risk management program. As technology continues to evolve, more and more organizations are utilizing multiple vendors, whether it be cloud providers, security providers, tools like the SolarWinds, Orion tools. So you most certainly need a program, and from my perspective, the program needs to be driven by governance, and then it needs to be, enforced. So you need to have a policy that says how you're going to manage these organizations. If you're looking to bring someone on board, you're going to ask them to probably fill out a questionnaire. You need to review that questionnaire, go back and ask questions on it. And then you need to, have them verify it, potentially produce independent third-party test results that they have tested whatever product it is they're providing to you. And then you probably should go out and hire someone to test it yourself. To ensure that, it is secure and it's functioning as designed without backdoors. So it's, extremely important and will only become more and more important.
Jerry, a follow-up question. I'm putting together one of these vendor risk management, supply chain risk management programs. Is it a days thing? Is it a weeks thing? Is it a months thing? What's the easiest way for a company to get started with a vendor or supply chain risk management program?
Again, depending on the number of vendors, I mean, I spoke to a client last year that had 10,000 vendors. I think you could get a program up and running within several months, and then it's just not a matter of putting the program in place. It needs to be maintained and ongoing. Diligence really on the vendors, and you need people to manage the program. So as with anything, it takes, resources and time.
Can I piggyback on that for something, Paul?
Or absolutely.
Thank you. One of the things that has come up a couple of times now is that if, with us and our clients, is if you've never thought about hiring a process engineer, the time to do it is when you're doing a third-party oversight program. And the reason is that the first step that's so important is just getting a standardized process so that all of your towers, even the ones that are way out on, there might be some communications or, some kind of like fund or charity organization that you have, those are just as vulnerable to bringing on vendors that come onto your network. So you need to be sure to standardize that process and make sure that it's one that works for everyone and that vendors are still coming through and the flow is moving so that the company doesn't come to a standstill. So for us, that's been a big help to start out with.
So good question from the audience here. I'm going to ask you, Kate, Chris, Jerry, you've all been around government for quite some time. Is this the most important executive order that a president has put out when it comes to cybersecurity?
I think it's the culmination of a lot of study and across multiple administrations to really pull together as much of this in one document as possible. There's obviously a lot of talent and a lot of expertise that's gone into this all the way back through the years with Michael Daniel and Tom Bossert and across administrations. You've just got a lot of really good folks that know the space that have been saying these things. But in executing across the federal space, as an example of what we were just talking about, one of the things that DHS is attempting to pilot right now is a supply chain risk management process similar to CMMC out of DoD. And so their CMMC-like approach is to use what the DoD is using and trying to apply it to federal civilian agencies that aren't well suited or prepared to do that. And so these pilots are in fits and starts to try and get underway in just the supply chain risk management aspect of it. So I think that the EO overall is hitting the right marks, but now it's, it's as Jerry was indicating, you've got to execute against this thing in a way that government can make progress. And that is oftentimes the stumbling block with a lot of EOs.
Keith, what about you? President Obama, President Biden, who wins when it comes to executive orders?
So I mean, I think that one of the most important ones, certainly Obama in 2013 doing the critical infrastructure groupings. Right. We now see that I have a little bit extra oversight, which includes the financial services sector, wastewater, oil and gas, energy, nuclear. That was important in highlighting what the government is going to be concentrating on. After the Colonial Pipeline hack, I really question whether that has done very much in terms of actually getting. I think the really critical, like the super critical, were nuclear, defense industrial, I think, and financial services, and those did get a lot of attention from regulators. But if this is for those who don't know what we're talking about, the DHS has, I think, 17 groups of critical infrastructure companies or industries that they consider to be critical to the infrastructure of the United States, and should include a lot more oversight for cybersecurity. I also thought that the agreement, and I don't know if it was supported by an executive order, but the sort of gentleman's agreement between Obama and the Chinese government over no longer stealing intellectual property that happened back, I think, in the first Obama administration, is the most important one that happened. And the reason I think it's so important is because it clearly failed. And that sort of diplomatic approach to trying to stop mass thefts of information and mass hacks from another nation state is one that probably isn't worth trying again, at least not with China or with, certainly not with Russia. I don't think anybody's tried to just kindly ask them to stop attacking us. So maybe we should, I don't know. But I mean, I think for the future, it's going to be a lot bigger of a battle for calming things down on either side of those.
So Jerry, let me ask you a question on the executive order, a different question, and I think it's probably one of the most misunderstood, misused terms in the whole cybersecurity genre. In Section 3, modernizing the federal government, they talk about let's develop a plan to implement zero trust architecture. What on earth is zero trust architecture?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So zero trust, it's sometimes known as perimeterless security. With all the different interconnections going on nowadays, you can't, the conventional thinking was that if you were within the network, you could be trusted. And basically zero trust is, you don't trust anyone by default. You are constantly checking whether you are inside and outside the perimeter, because in effect nowadays, with all the cloud-based applications and the Internet of Things and all the different applications that are being used, nothing is really, within a perimeter. There is really no more perimeter. So you just cannot trust anyone by default. Everything needs to be constantly, authenticated through certificates and other types of systems.
Is that what you're talking about here? In Section 3D, is that what you're talking about in terms of trust when you're talking about multi-factor authentication?
Oh yeah, yeah. Multifactor is, is a great tool. If they are able to compromise the network, the human factor is always a big thing. You could have a 0.0001% click rate, but if you have 5,000 employees and one person clicks on the spearfish email, they're in the network, and then they can compromise credentials. But having multi-factor makes that much more difficult. So multi-factor is also another key security tool that should be employed by organizations.
Let's talk a little bit about, our time is, I can't believe our time is coming to an end. Let's talk about this last slide here. Bob, question for you. Obviously, cybersecurity is not intuitive. It's not easy. It hasn't been around a long time, like audit committee rules and things of that nature. How important is it to educate board members on cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's a part of a critical control process, right? You can't govern what you don't understand. And I always like to say that 100% of boards wish they'd taken a better approach to cybersecurity risk oversight 100% of the time after a breach. Just look at what SolarWinds did in terms of adding a tech and cyber committee and adding people in the boardroom that can spend more time on these issues and then actually understand these issues. So let them learn from their mistake, let them be the leading light, and get the right people and the right structure focused on these issues. It's 101. And that's what we saw with Sarbanes-Oxley and financial skills, since you mentioned it, Paul. Just one final point. It was only 19 years ago when it was a novel concept to have somebody in the boardroom that understood a financial statement. That's what Sarbanes-Oxley forced. And, I think in hindsight, it's amazing to think that that was only 19 years ago, but we're at a similar point for these skills on the corporate board. We don't have the same regulatory hammer forcing it, but there's nothing that prevents companies from addressing this at a much more effective level on their own.
Here's a great question. Here's a great question. And it comes from one of our, kind group of reporters that were participating in today's presentation. Given what Kate mentioned about the potential vulnerabilities of, entities such as New York Stock Exchange, DTCC, SIFMAS, et al., is it time for the federal government to issue clear, detailed, and binding requirements for cybersecurity along the lines of the EO that all organizations designated as critical infrastructure must follow, not just government contractors and not just piecemeal by sector? So, Chris, what do you think of that? How do we change the paradigm? Is it as this person says, we need something in writing, we need to fix this, and we need to fix it now?
No, I think that that's a very insightful question, because it really begs this notion of, is there a consistent standard that can be applied across the 16 or 17 critical infrastructure sectors? And as they drill down into that at DHS, when you've got 55 national critical functions that span chemical, dams, electric, chemical, there's just a whole mix of different industries out there. But if we're designating these industries as critical infrastructure for the country, there's a reason for it. And there needs to be clear and consistent guidance that goes with that, so that folks in the private sector can understand what the rules of the road look like. And it's not like, I was a little concerned about yesterday's announcement with TSA on the pipeline issue, because it's kind of a one-off. And next time it won't be a pipeline, it'll be some other critical infrastructure like a chemical plant. And then are we going to then issue it for chemical plants? It needs to be much more broad and consistent across the sectors.
So, Kate, what do you think, given your view from the outside in on cybersecurity matters? Is it time for a firm guideline that companies must do?
I mean, I think there have been a lot of firm guidelines out there. What I think what we mean by firm is there needs to be enforcement of that. Now, DHS does not have the ability to enforce any of the suggested, and that may have changed, and Chris can weigh in on this. They don't have a punitive capability where they can fine a company for not complying with what they suggest in their critical infrastructure guidelines. Now, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has, or NIST, has a framework that a large, portion of companies follow, and there are other frameworks that, that have similar characteristics. So taking one of those frameworks, I know DHS and other organizations have been trying to push for a long time to have something adopted that is the framework, and there's many different documents. I mean, Treasury has its own. Treasury, of course, regulates the banks on cybersecurity. You mentioned TSA does the pipelines. NERC does the energy industry and some of the other electrical things. So you have many different regulators, some of whom have a capability of fining or creating some sort of punishment. Some of them do not. And mostly, if we do something in terms of there being hard guidelines, there needs to be a reason to follow them. There needs to be some sort of punishment. The SEC might be more poised to do that. Of course, then you're only hitting publicly traded companies. A lot of third-party software providers don't fall into that.
Well, you make a good point, Kate. But after this cybersecurity framework, was emphasized by the Obama administration, I was litigating cases where it was alleged that, the defendant companies didn't follow the cybersecurity framework, didn't do this and didn't do that. So I do think there's a litigation, not just a regulatory aspect of things, and that's happening as well too, but there's a litigation, aspect of these things, as we have seen, not just in SolarWinds, but in the Colonial Pipeline as well too. We are wrapping up here. We're about 2:01. Have one last question. Everyone's got 2 minutes to answer the question. Are we prepared for the next sophisticated nation state attack? Jerry, what do you think?
Absolutely not. So there's still, I think we've come a long way. I think back to, late 2015 and 2016 when I was part of the working group representing the FBI, working with, the NSC led by Michael Daniel, the cyber group, working on PPD 41, where we were still arguing over, how agencies were going to work together. So, and now the most recent executive order, I think, is the next step in that process. But I just think that networks are still so complicated, and there's still so many organizations, including government agencies, that aren't doing the basics, that we're just not prepared for the next attack.
Hey, Bob, question to you. Are boards of directors prepared? Are companies prepared?
Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being totally prepared, I say we're about at a 2, and we're not going to move that needle until we start to understand systemic risk and how it interacts with cyber risk. Hackers have clearly figured out that the system is in and of itself the weak point, and they're exploiting it. Unfortunately, we're at ground zero in defending it.
Kate, what do you think? You advise a lot of companies. You advise companies on an incident response, business continuity, crisis communications planning. Are we prepared for the next attack?
No, I also agree. We are not. I also would go further and say we are also not prepared for the next unsophisticated attack. In that, when you look at what happened with the Colonial Pipeline, this was not like the SolarWinds attack. This was a ransomware attack. And in fact, from everything that I understand about this incident, the pipeline itself was shut down, and all of this disruption was caused because the company was confused about what it should do. The pipeline software was not affected. They shut the pipeline down because they didn't know how to respond to the incident. And that tells me that we are unprepared for many things, and that these incidents can cause mass confusion. We just don't know. A simple incident can cause a great deal of harm. And so I think we have a lot of preparedness, mitigation, and those sorts of things to do.
Hey, Chris, I'm going to end it with you, and I think I know the answer to what you're going to say. Is the government prepared for the next big cyber attack?
Well, and thanks for putting this together. I think it's a really thoughtful conversation that we've been having. And one of the things I think Bob made the point, I think is so insightful on this is that, systemically, we're just not well positioned to handle this, right? You've got the government aspect of it, and the government is not prepared because there's, as Kate indicated, so many dependencies, whether it's Treasury or energy or the different regulatory structures that are in place. 85% of the infrastructure is in the hands of the private sector, who is hesitant at times to share information with the government for good reason sometimes. And so you've got a system in place that's not particularly nimble at handling the kinds of constantly evolving, sophisticated attacks that we're seeing across supply chain, ransomware, denial of service, and all the rest. So I think we've got our work cut out for us on this with so much attacks surface and so many places for the adversaries to turn, and a lot of work for us to do in the government and private sector to raise our game.
A lot of work. Well, on behalf of Seyfarth Shaw, Lori Allman, and John Napoli, the managing partners of the New York office, I want to thank Chris, Kate, Bob, and Jerry for participating. You guys are great. You guys are terrific. It's great not just to see you in the worst of times like during a breaches, but in the best of times where we can discuss such critical issues that face our great country. So I want to thank everybody for participating. Morgan, I believe we have an email slide as well too at the end. You see our emails. If anybody wants to ask any questions, you want to have any further discussions about SolarWinds and the executive order, please feel free to reach out to any of the panelists. Again, thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Well, is there a CLE to give at the end?
Oh, there is a CLE. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Oh, I knew I forgot something. CLE code S as in Sam, 3822, SS 3822. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm sorry I forgot the CLE code.
Thank you.
Have a great